Hello everyone, welcome to Hopeful Moments 1. Today, we're going to listen to a story about the irresponsibility and disrespect of some roommates, and how the storyteller managed to protect themselves and demand fair compensation after being deceived and exploited. Today's story will take you through a surprising situation. He hid their belongings in their own suitcases, a place they surely would never think to check. This not only made them furious but also put the storyteller in a position of power to negotiate. If you find this story interesting and filled with meaningful lessons, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more valuable lessons. The selfishness and unreasonable demands of my college roommates truly made me feel frustrated and suffocated. From the beginning, they seemed to think that I had an obligation to serve them unconditionally, no matter my circumstances. At first, I thought these were just casual requests, playful interactions between housemates, but gradually, it became an unreasonable expectation that I could not meet. Things began to get tense when they got angry because I didn't cook for them, even though I had explained several times that I could only cook for myself due to my limited budget. Not only was I a student with tight finances, but I also had to carefully balance my expenses to maintain my life. Yet, they didn't care about that at all. Not only did they lack understanding, but they even got angry, accusing me of being selfish for only looking after myself. What shocked me even more was their unreasonable demand. Not only did they want me to cook, but they also expected me to pay for the ingredients. An absurd and completely illogical request. They wanted me to spend my own money to serve them, as if it was an obvious duty I had to fulfill. I firmly refused. Not because I didn't want to help, but because it was beyond my capacity and completely unfair. But their reaction couldn't have been worse. Instead of accepting my refusal and respecting my personal rights, they chose to retaliate aggressively. One day, when I returned to my room, I found my belongings thrown all over the place, with some even tossed straight into the trash. I couldn't believe my eyes. The things I had worked hard to buy and keep, now treated like garbage just because I didn't meet their unreasonable demands. In that moment, I felt both angry and deeply hurt. Whether I cooked or not should have been a small issue, but the way they treated me went beyond the minimum respect one should show to housemates. Throwing my things in the trash wasn't just immature, it was a blatant insult to my personal rights. They not only invaded my private space but also intentionally showed that I had no claim to anything that belonged to me, an extremely selfish and authoritarian mentality. That was the moment I realized I could no longer live in this toxic environment. I couldn't live with people who saw me as a tool to serve them, rather than an equal roommate. From that moment on, I understood that I needed to stand up for my rights and find a way to escape this situation, because if I continued to endure, they would only disrespect me more. I thought long and hard before deciding to share this story. Not because I'm afraid of being judged, but because I've been through too much trouble, especially with my ex-mother-in-law and ex-wife. Those memories still haunt me in some way, but I think it's time to share part of my experience so I can close the chapter on the painful things. Maybe this will be my last post here. I don't want to keep living in the past, in memories that hurt me. But before I completely let go, I want to express my final thoughts on what I've been through. It seems I've always encountered toxic people in my life. I don't know if it's coincidence or if I subconsciously attract such people. My mother, my ex-wife, my ex-mother-in-law, who passed away before we finalized our divorce, a malicious colleague who blatantly gave my number to my biological mother, and now these terrible college roommates. It seems that at every stage of my life, I have to face people who make my life stressful and full of pressure. But fortunately, amidst these dark times, there are still some bright spots. I still have good friends, a stable job, and an active lifestyle that helps me maintain balance. However, I can't deny that there are times when I feel like I'm a magnet for narcissists, people who only care about their own interests and are ready to trample on others' emotions. I truly hope that cycle has ended. When I was a student, I had to live with 3 terrible roommates for 6 long months. It wasn't a prestigious university with modern dorms, but just a community college where students had to take care of their own accommodation. So, my 3 roommates and I rented an old apartment, probably built in the 80s, with outdated furniture and an uncomfortable living space. As a student working part-time, I faced many financial difficulties. Money was always tight, forcing me to be extremely frugal with my spending. Ironically, I was the only one in the apartment who knew how to cook, and in the end, I became the only one responsible for washing the dishes. Not because I liked doing all that, but because if I didn't, no one else would. When it came to buying food, I wasn't the type to care too much about hunting for coupons, but because of my limited finances, I had to find ways to save. The area we lived in only had 2 decent grocery stores, a regular supermarket with high prices, and a small discount food store I often visited. Additionally, I would often stop by the local thrift shop to buy necessary items at the cheapest price possible. In stark contrast to me, my roommates never cared about saving or maintaining a healthy lifestyle. They mostly lived off snacks and ready-made food. This not only drained a lot of money but also impacted the whole apartment. They rarely cleaned up, leaving trash and fast food boxes piled up in the kitchen. This made it impossible for me to keep leftovers because the fridge space was always taken up by their unhealthy snacks. Of course, things didn't stop there. The issue of dividing household chores was always a point of contention. I had reminded them several times that everyone needed to take responsibility for cleaning the common spaces, but most of the time, my words were ignored. Arguments erupted continuously. They thought I was too picky, while I just wanted a minimally clean and non-cluttered living space. Fortunately, this issue was eventually resolved, but not because they changed, it was because I was so tired and chose to compromise in order to keep the peace. 2 of the 3 roommates had been close friends even before college, so they always sided with each other. The 3rd roommate initially seemed neutral but eventually integrated with the other 2, leaving me as the only one isolated in my own apartment. Living with such roommates was truly a mental challenge. I went through moments of stress, exhaustion, and even despair when I felt trapped in an unhealthy environment. But no matter how bad things got, I didn't lose myself. I continued studying, working, and trying to maintain balance in my life. Though these experiences were far from pleasant, they taught me an important lesson about people and how to deal with difficult situations. I realized that not everyone will treat me fairly, and not everyone deserves my kindness and patience. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes, leaving is the best choice to protect my peace of mind. Now, looking back, I no longer feel anger or resentment towards my old roommates. I only feel grateful that those experiences made me stronger, more mature, and better at protecting myself in future relationships. And perhaps, just like the other bad things in my life, I will let these memories rest so I can move forward with a lighter heart. The conflict between me and my roommate started with what seemed like a very simple matter but gradually became tense and prolonged. It was a food issue. Who would have thought that a simple breakfast could become the cause of discomfort between housemates? That day was a peaceful morning, and I decided to treat myself to a simple yet nutritious breakfast, a scrambled egg sandwich. With just 2 fried eggs, depending on my mood, I'd either leave the yolk slightly runny or cook it through, a slice of creamy cheese, soft, fragrant bread, and a bit of mayonnaise to enhance the flavor. It's a dish I love, quick, budget-friendly, and gives me a warm feeling every morning. When I placed the hot sandwich on the plate, the inviting aroma spread throughout the small kitchen. I felt satisfied because nothing is better than preparing a meal for myself. But that joy didn't last long, because just as I sat down to enjoy my meal, one of my roommates walked into the kitchen. He stared at the sandwich in my hand, his eyes full of desire, and immediately spoke. "Make me one like that." His request took me by surprise. Not because I was stingy or didn't want to share, but because I wasn't prepared to cook for someone else at that moment. I had just finished making my breakfast, the pan had been washed, and most importantly, I was trying to keep my spending under control. I smiled politely and explained. "I'm trying to save money for other meals, so I only bought enough ingredients for myself. Besides, the pan has just been washed, and it's not convenient to cook again." I thought this was a reasonable and gentle refusal, but his reaction surprised me. He shook his head and sighed in disappointment, as though I had done something extremely selfish. Feeling that the situation could become awkward, I continued. If you like this dish, you can buy the ingredients and make it yourself. It's not hard, I can show you how to do it. But instead of agreeing or at least showing a bit of goodwill, he was displeased. He shrugged, frowned, and said in an annoyed tone, "It's just a few eggs and some bread. What's the big deal if you make one for me?" At that moment, I felt the irritation rising within me. I didn't owe him a breakfast, and I certainly wasn't obligated to serve anyone. Especially since I had explained my reasons politely, yet instead of accepting it, he acted like I had done something wrong. I kept calm and reiterated my point. It's not that I don't want to help, but I don't have enough ingredients and I don't want to cook again right now. If you really want to eat, it's best you make it yourself. He didn't say anything more, but his disappointed expression was clearly visible. The whole room fell into an unnecessary, heavy atmosphere. And this wasn't the last time I encountered such a situation. A few days later, I was preparing breakfast again, this time boiling soft eggs, a simple dish, but one that always made me feel comfortable and familiar. I had loved this dish for a long time, not just because of its taste, but also because it reminded me of the rare peaceful moments in my busy life. I carefully boiled the eggs for just the right amount of time, enough for the whites to set completely while keeping the yolk smooth and creamy. After peeling the eggs, I mashed them in a bowl with a fork to create a smooth, slightly chunky mixture. This dish may seem simple, but it requires a bit of finesse. If you boil the eggs for too long or too quickly, the result won't be as expected. In fact, I only succeed about half the time, but every time I get it just right, I feel incredibly satisfied. With just a little salt, pepper, and sometimes a bit of hot sauce, I had a fantastic breakfast. I usually enjoy it with some crispy toast, or sometimes even with rice. Eggs aren't just an economical option, but they also help me avoid eating sugary cereals in the morning, a thing I had to eat throughout my childhood just because they were cheap and convenient. At the discount food store near my house, a carton of eggs costs about $1, and I always choose this option for a tasty and nutritious meal that doesn't break my tight budget. But what bothered me wasn't the cooking process, but my roommates' reactions. Even though I had told them many times that I was happy to teach them how to cook and that they could easily make dishes like this if they spent a little time, they deliberately ignored me. Instead of taking the opportunity to learn, they would just stand there watching me cook and complain. Again? You always make such good food and never share anything. Those complaints gradually became a repetitive chorus every time I went into the kitchen. They wanted a delicious meal like mine but didn't want to lift a finger. They didn't want to buy the ingredients, didn't want to learn how to cook, didn't want to spend the time, but they still wanted the same result I had. It was so contradictory and unreasonable. The more I thought about it, the more unfair it felt. I was the poorest in the group. I only had an old Nintendo 64, an outdated CRT TV, a GameCube that I had to save up for, and a slow, old laptop. Meanwhile, my roommates owned much more expensive devices. They had the latest game consoles, new laptops, and one of them even had a car. They had more than enough money to buy ingredients, and they could even hire someone to cook for them, yet they still wanted to take advantage of me. They didn't appreciate the effort I put in. Most of the time, they just sat around playing games, watching YouTube, or doing meaningless things when they weren't in class. At first, I thought living with people like this wouldn't be too much trouble because at least they didn't bother me. But over time, I realized they saw me as someone they could easily exploit, a person who could be forced to do whatever they wanted without resistance. Unfortunately, they misjudged me. I may be an easygoing person, but only to a certain extent. When someone tries to push me too far, I won't just sit and endure it. And they were the ones who crossed the line. Everything came to a head one evening when I decided to treat myself to a nice meal after a long, tiring day. That night, I chose to make tilapia, a dish I really enjoy because it's not only easy to prepare but also incredibly delicious. Occasionally, I even transformed it into spicy fish cakes, a flavorful dish I absolutely love. As I carefully marinated the fish with my favorite spices, heated up the pan, and began cooking, the atmosphere in the apartment suddenly felt different. The scent of the food spread throughout the room, and before long, my roommates started gathering around. But instead of praising me or asking for the recipe, they bombarded me with a series of irritated complaints. Why does your food always taste so good, while we have to eat cold leftovers from the microwave? We can't just go out and buy good food every day. Who do you think you are cooking for yourself like this? I was stunned. They didn't even ask if I would share the meal, they just blamed me. Was I at fault for knowing how to cook? Was I wrong for taking care of myself? I calmly replied that I couldn't cook for the whole group every day because I had to be strict with my budget. But if they really wanted a good meal, I was happy to make spaghetti for everyone the next day, as long as each person contributed $5 to share the cost of the ingredients. They immediately agreed. I sighed with relief, thinking that I had finally found a way to reconcile with them, or at least set some clear boundaries. I bought the ingredients, prepared everything carefully, and spent time cooking a delicious pot of spaghetti, trying to make everything perfect so that everyone would have a hearty meal. But my biggest mistake was not asking them to pay up front. When I brought the dish to the table, expecting at least a thank you or some basic respect, the worst thing happened. They immediately started eating, not even mentioning the money they had promised. When I reminded them, they looked at each other, smirked, and pretended not to hear. One of them casually said, "Come on, it's just one meal, why are you making such a big deal out of it?" Another chimed in. "Are you really going to count the money with your roommates? You're living with us and you're being so stingy?" I was speechless. They didn't just take advantage of my kindness, but they also made me feel like the one at fault in this situation. Every bite of spaghetti they were eating seemed to become more expensive than any dish I had ever made for myself, not because of the ingredients, but because I had paid for it with my trust and kindness. At that moment, I realized I could no longer live in such an environment. This was no longer about food, money, or a plate of spaghetti. This was about respect, and clearly, I wasn't getting any from these people. And so, the final blow came, leading me to the inevitable decision: I had to leave. One day, after enduring months of silence and disrespect from my roommates, I decided to do something different. I thought that if I put effort into cooking and shared a nice meal with everyone, at least they would understand the value of sharing and respect. So, I decided to go outside and head to the nearby supermarket to buy ingredients for a great spaghetti meal. I picked easy-to-make dishes that were still nutritious: ground beef, a jar of spaghetti sauce, spaghetti noodles, a loaf of garlic bread, and a can of green beans. These dishes were not only easy to prepare but also perfect for a hearty meal, and I hoped they would make everyone happy and at least a little grateful. As I returned to the apartment and started preparing, I couldn't stop thinking about what I was hoping for: a simple but heartfelt meal, and hoping that at least everyone would understand that I wasn't cooking for myself, but for the whole group. I spent a lot of time preparing each dish, from sautéing the ground beef to cooking the spaghetti without breaking it, and preparing each piece of crispy garlic bread. Once the meal was finished, I set everything on the table and turned to my roommates, happily saying, "I made this spaghetti for us. If you want to eat, I just ask that each person contributes $5 to share the cost of the ingredients." However, their reaction was nothing like I expected. They looked at each other and then burst out laughing, as if I had told a joke. One of them even said, "You think we're going to pay for a meal like this? Are you kidding?" It felt like a slap in the face. The disrespect and disregard they showed toward my offer made it hard to believe what had just happened. I had hoped that at least they would understand the value of my efforts, but instead, they mocked me and ignored my very reasonable request. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't help feeling disappointed. I had done my best, but they didn't appreciate my efforts. I stood firm and continued to demand they pay, making it clear that I didn't want to cook for a group of people who didn't appreciate it. But they reacted as if I was doing something wrong, with one of them even saying, "You just want to show off your cooking skills. Why don't you share with us? If that's the case, then don't cook for anyone anymore." These words were like a punch to my self-esteem. Not only did they not respect me, but they also tried to make me feel guilty for asking them to contribute to the shared meal. This situation was truly beyond my tolerance. I had put effort and care into this meal, but instead of receiving gratitude, I was met with disregard and criticism. There was nothing more to say. I decided that from now on, I would never cook for them again. I stood up, not even looking at them, and clearly said, "From now on, I will not cook for you anymore. If you don't appreciate it, I won't do it." And so, I ended my futile efforts. I realized that sometimes, when you do everything to please others but don't receive respect in return, the best thing is to stop. Even though they tried to convince me again, and one of them even offered to pay me back, I could never forget how they had rejected me the first time. My self-respect could no longer endure their unreasonable rejections. This was not just a rejected request, but a profound lesson about not placing trust in people who don't know how to respect others. I felt I had done the right thing by firmly rejecting their apologies. Whether or not they had the money, I stood firm in my self-respect. I made it clear that I no longer had an obligation to cook for them. This wasn't revenge, but self-respect. Our relationship couldn't continue if they kept seeing me as a tool to satisfy their needs without appreciating me. They reacted like spoiled children when their parents didn't fulfill their demands. Their anger and helplessness were clear, but I was too tired of always trying to please others. I realized that if I continued like this, I would only harm myself. Their words were just meaningless shouts, unable to change my decision. I no longer felt the need to explain or apologize. Every time I explained, they just saw it as an opportunity to justify their actions. But this time, I was determined not to do that. I no longer needed to explain because I knew what I was doing and why I was doing it. I was no longer someone easily swayed by unreasonable demands. The feeling of no longer being caught up in their demands was a feeling of liberation. I felt like I had regained control of my life, and no one had the right to take away my self-respect anymore. They could be angry, they could be disappointed, but that was their problem, not mine. The change in my actions and attitude created a clear barrier between us. The relationship between us became more strained than ever. They couldn't accept that I no longer fulfilled their requests, and I no longer felt the need to maintain a friendship where I didn't feel respected. The situation didn't stop there, it became even worse in a terrifying way. One day, after coming home from work, tired and just wanting to rest, I opened the fridge and kitchen cabinets only to find that all my food had been taken. Not just a few items, but everything I had carefully saved and prepared. The food I had budgeted for to maintain a balanced diet throughout the week, the little things I had painstakingly selected because they fit my tight budget, were all gone, with no reason. When I realized no one was home, and there was no explanation or apology, I felt like the world had collapsed beneath me. Anger began to rise, strong and overwhelming, like an uncontrollable wave. I felt completely betrayed. The people I had shared living space with, the ones I had tried to help when they needed it, were now treating me as if I didn't exist, as if my belongings weren't worth respecting. At that moment, I just wanted to find some way to relieve the stress, to forget about the negative feelings I was carrying. I tried playing games, hoping that the virtual world would help me forget this harsh reality. But nothing seemed to get easier. When I went to my favorite game systems, the old N64 I had carefully kept for years, the GameCube I had saved every penny for, items that were not just hobbies but also part of my memories in youth, I realized they were gone too. The feeling I had was absolute anger and helplessness. This wasn't just a material loss, it was an invasion into my personal space and interests. To me, these items weren't just things, they were parts of my life, memories, a mark of respect for the things I had worked hard to obtain. When they were taken without any explanation, I didn't just feel anger but also a deep sense of violation. I couldn't bear this feeling anymore. Every time I looked into the room I had carefully decorated and maintained, I only saw emptiness and the pain consuming my heart. The people I had once hoped could share joyful moments and support each other in tough times had now become people I couldn't trust, the ones who had taken away what was most important to me. And the worst part was, I didn't know what to do to escape this feeling. At that point, when my sense of helplessness increased, I decided to turn to a close friend who lived nearby for advice. He was the only one I thought could understand and help me look at the situation more objectively. He was the one who had sold me the GameCube I cherished, and I believed he would have a different perspective to help me figure out how to deal with this. I told him everything, from the stolen food to the loss of my important personal items. After listening, he suggested a plan to resolve the issue, one that I felt quite confused about and not at all sensible. He proposed I confront my roommates and record their reactions with a digital camera. He said this would give me evidence of their actions and create pressure for them to take responsibility. It sounded reasonable, but I knew this plan would only cause more conflict and make me lose some of the respect I still had left. However, this was a suggestion I couldn't refuse. He would only agree to help me with the plan if I paid him $20. This was money I didn't have, as I only had a limited budget to maintain my life. In my desperation and with no other options, I reluctantly agreed. This only made me feel more frustrated and diminished my self-respect because I had to depend on a plan I felt was beneath me. The sense of disappointment and the internal conflict I felt at that time were beyond description. I had reached a point where every option seemed imperfect, but I had no choice but to accept a solution that made me feel deeply uncomfortable. While I understood I needed to protect my rights, this method made me feel like I was falling into a trap I had set for myself. I couldn't endure any more disrespect and deception, but at the same time, I couldn't accept sacrificing my self-respect to achieve a fairness that seemed more and more distant. When my roommates came back after the party, I didn't even need to look at their faces to sense the smugness radiating from their posture. Their steps were full of satisfaction, as if they had won an invisible battle. They laughed, appeared confident, and didn't even doubt that something was wrong. The feeling that everything had ended in their eyes was obvious. However, when they opened the door and discovered that their gaming systems and laptops were missing, their smugness quickly turned into rage. The whole room suddenly fell silent, and the atmosphere became tense as their faces grew dark. I wasn't the only one who felt the change. It felt like a bomb was about to explode. Shouting and threats of violence followed, simply because I dared to resist their previous wrongdoings. They thought I was just an easy target, someone who would always submit to their anger. But this time was different. I didn't back down. I stood firm, and even though the anger in my heart was rising, I remained calm, coldly stating that if they wanted their stuff back, they would have to tell me where it was. I was no longer afraid of their threats. I wouldn't give any information unless they returned what they had taken from me. My words were a challenge they couldn't easily ignore. The tension in the air was suffocating. They could be angry, but I didn't feel scared at all. This was a powerful change in me, a moment when I realized that I was no longer afraid of those who had once taken advantage of me. I no longer feared standing up for myself, no longer afraid of fractured relationships. The injustice I had faced had changed me, and now, I had nothing left to lose. When I reminded them about throwing my food into the trash outside just a few hours ago, I could see their confusion and anger growing clearer in their eyes. Just by looking at their faces, I understood they couldn't justify their actions. But then, instead of apologizing or admitting fault, they did something that made me even angrier. They hid my gaming systems, TV, and even some of my precious personal items in the building, and then went off to a party. When I confronted them about this, their excuse was completely unreasonable. They claimed they had been drinking all day, from morning to night, just because the weekend had arrived, and they had the right to do whatever they wanted, as if they were allowed to behave irresponsibly without facing any consequences. That explanation was truly pathetic, and I felt like they were treating me with complete disdain. The culmination of my pain came when they started pretending that everything was just a silly prank they had pulled while drunk. They tried to blame me for being too serious and not looking at things from their laid-back perspective. But I couldn't understand how they could be so thoughtless. How could they treat me as a joke when I was genuinely being exploited and disrespected? I couldn't keep my composure any longer, and I burst out laughing, but it wasn't a joyful laugh, it was a mocking one, as if I was seeing their hypocrisy and irresponsibility in their very actions. I told them that they were the real villains, unable to distinguish right from wrong, and I was simply retaliating for what they had done. I had tried to be patient, tried to make excuses for them, but now I no longer wanted to waste my time with people who couldn't understand my feelings. They hadn't just invaded my space, but they had violated my freedom and dignity. The contempt I had for them was real, and now I had accepted that continuing to tolerate their actions would only hurt me more. One of them seemed like he was about to explode with anger, like he wanted to charge at me. But in that moment, I drew his attention to the nearby window. Suddenly, they noticed our friend standing outside the window, recording everything with a digital camera. He gave me an okay sign and quickly ran down the emergency stairs before the roommates could do anything. They couldn't do anything now, as they knew that their actions had been captured on film. I looked at their faces, staying calm while making it clear that the footage would be evidence of everything they had done. I wasn't just talking about stealing my stuff, but also about their harassment and underage drinking, which was illegal because we were all under 21 at the time. I also warned them that if they didn't return my things immediately, I would give the footage to the department head. I knew that would leave a stain on their records. They definitely didn't want to be added to the list of students violating school rules, especially after a few girls were expelled last year for bullying their roommates. I could see their faces change completely. They were confused, anxious, and couldn't escape the consequences of their wrongdoings. At that moment, I had regained control. I demanded they return everything immediately, and I also demanded they compensate me for the meal I had painstakingly cooked. This was my moment. I was no longer the one to be easily manipulated and passive. All I was asking for was respect and fairness. It was time for them to face the consequences of their wrong actions, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. They rushed outside without saying a word, as if trying to escape the consequences of what they had done. After a while, they came back, but instead of remorse, they brought my gaming systems and games in a filthy trash bag. Not only that, but they also retrieved my food from the trash, hoping I would accept it as if everything could go back to the way it was. But for me, this wasn't an apology. The food had been in the trash for hours, which was completely unacceptable. I refused to touch it and bluntly told them they could only pay in cash, no negotiations. Moreover, when I checked my TV, I realized it had fallen and shattered. My anger surged because not only had I lost a valuable item, but I had been treated like a joke. I demanded they replace the broken TV, and I didn't just want compensation for the food, but also for the spaghetti meal they had refused to pay for. After some hesitation, they asked me how much I wanted. I said I wanted each of them to pay me $60 in cash, $50 to replace the food they threw away, $5 for the spaghetti they didn't pay for, and the rest to cover the cost of the friend who had to stand outside the window for 2 hours in the cold to record the footage of them. They looked at each other, then reluctantly pulled out their wallets, hands trembling as they gave me the money. It wasn't hard for them, as they had boasted before that their parents and scholarships paid for everything, making it easy for them to have enough cash for anything. After receiving the money, I showed them where I had hidden their things and told them not to bother me again. One of them handed me his small TV to replace the broken one, and I accepted. The situation was temporarily resolved, but not long after, they started avoiding me. None of them wanted to interact with me if they could avoid it. However, their relationship didn't last long. They couldn't stand each other anymore, and the third member of their group no longer wanted anything to do with them. Although they still hated me, the two who moved out were the ones who had caused the most trouble. They no longer followed me, and when we still had shared classes, they avoided me as if I were invisible. As for the last remaining roommate, surprisingly, he had changed a lot. Not only had he improved himself, but he also made sure to tell the new roommates not to bother me. He was the only one among them who had understood and respected me. We began to become close friends, not just because of a simple love for cooking but also because we shared a passion for Nintendo and cycling. We frequently played Mario Kart together and began biking during a difficult time in my life after my divorce. He became a trusted companion and my biggest supporter, even more important than my own family. As for where I hid the roommates' things, I decided to place them in their suitcases, which I carefully stored in the closet. That was the last place they would think of looking. When they realized their stuff had been there all along, their anger flared up again, but this time, I didn't care. And that's how the story ended. What they had done would always be a lesson for both me and them. The conclusion of this story is that sometimes, confronting and standing up for your rights is necessary, but it should be done wisely and firmly. The protagonist learned how to protect themselves and not be exploited, while also understanding that justice doesn't just come from words but also from strong actions. However, the biggest lesson here is respect. In relationships, whether friends or colleagues, mutual respect is the most important factor. Without respect, any relationship will easily become tense and lead to conflict. The advice for the protagonist in this story is to stay true to their principles but also remember that forgiveness and allowing others to change is the way to maintain healthy and sustainable relationships.